this week, the role of nuclear weapons in a shifting geopolitical landscape. My name's Alessandra, and as you can imagine, I work at the International Peace Bureau, and my colleague Emily is also here with me today. A brief introduction about the International Peace Bureau. It was founded in 1891 and is one of the world's oldest international peace organizations. We are a global network of peace and peace-related organizations and activists, and have developed regional networks to support their activities and work. Our core mission is achieving peace through disarmament and cooperation. IPB was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1910 for acting as a link between the peace societies of various countries. Our main campaigns include the Global Campaign Against Military Spending, GCOMS, which culminates in Global Days of Action on Military Spending, known as GDAMs, each year during April and May. Our other campaign is our campaign for common security, where we argue for a revitalization of the concept originally developed in the 1980s, that security can only be achieved by making security between countries, not against one another. So starting us off today, we have a video that we recorded with Sérgio Duarte yesterday. Sérgio is president of the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, an international organization that seeks a world free of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction. He is also the former UN High Representative for Disarmament Affairs. Sérgio will give us an introduction and overview of the current geopolitical changes.
May I first of all thank Rainer Brown and the IPB, as well as the other organizers, for inviting me to this discussion on the role of nuclear weapons in a shifting political landscape. I might start by noting that the political landscape in the world is by nature a shifting one. Political realities are never at rest, and conditions shift continuously as nations interact in the political landscape. Stability is, in fact, a relative concept. Over the years, political relations experience constant change as time goes by. Economic, political, or defensive blocs and alliances change shape and membership according to shifting interests, perceptions, and realities. Not all those shifts have been negative. Despite retrogressions and imbalances, since the end of the Industrial Revolution, the world has witnessed constant improvement in patterns of consumption, access to health, increase in longevity, reduction of inequalities, distribution of wealth, and other important social indicators. Another sign of progress has been the creation of universal mechanisms for the treatment of problems relating to peace and security, environmental issues, economic and social development, promotion of human rights, financial crisis, and international trade. Non-governmental organizations and think tanks provide useful assistance to international agencies that operate these mechanisms. This structure was able to provide impetus to improved living conditions and to constructive interaction among governments and societies all over the world. Despite such positive features, the current international trade order remains anchored in the institutionalized imbalance of rights between the great powers and the rest of the international community. The international legal system, or recognized ethic imperatives, impose a number of limitations and conditionings on the behavior of the powerful. But humankind continues to witness episodes of aggression by the stronger against the weaker, as well as blatant disregard for the principles and purposes of the Charter of the United Nations. Major political shifts in the past few decades threaten the security of populations worldwide against the outbreak of conflict or related environmental disasters. Tensions within or between countries of origin, transit, or destination of massive population movements are a potential source of insecurity. Energy security is becoming an increasingly sensitive element in international relations, adding another source of tension between and among states. The degradation of the environment caused by human action and by changes in climate patterns already threatens the sustainability of life in different parts of the planet. The rise in average temperatures causes various and serious environmental hazards, such as water and food shortages, as well as flooding and further desertification, with consequent geopolitical tensions in many regions of the world. The ability of the international community to put into effect decisive, concerted measures to check or alleviate these trends may soon be beyond our means. Conflicts for control over or access to ever more scarce resources may break out in a not so distant future. The fast development of warfighting capabilities based on cyber technologies, space-based systems, and the use of artificial intelligence brings new security uncertainties. In the current political landscape, the threat of actual use of nuclear weapons has become a distinct possibility. The current possessors of nuclear weapons seem bent on increasing the range, accuracy, and destructive powers of their arsenals, as well as on adding new weapons based on cutting-edge technologies. It is important to recall in this context that the blunt warning by the Secretary General of the United Nations a couple of years ago at the Conference on Disarmament in Geneva, Mr. Guterres said, and I quote from him, "Key components of the international arms control architecture are collapsing. States are seeking security, not in the proven collective value of diplomacy and dialogue, but in developing and accumulating new weapons. We simply cannot afford to return to the unrestrained nuclear competition of the darkest days of the Cold War," end of quote. And I would add that unfortunately, we seem to have already reached this regrettable stage. However, the overwhelming majority of the international community seems to have come to the conclusion that such weapons are either not necessary for their security needs or beyond their means to acquire them. That may explain the current new universal adherence to the NPT, despite its flaws. As we know, nuclear weapons burst into the international scenario 21 days after the signature of the Charter of the United Nations. For that chronological reason, the Charter does not mention nuclear weapons. Nevertheless, the worldwide shock and horror following the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki led the General Assembly to adopt its very first resolution in January 1946, establishing a commission charged with presenting proposal for eliminating, and I stress eliminating, atomic weapons from national arsenals. Later on December 1946, the same session of the General Assembly recognized the urgency of the need to prohibit and eliminate atomic and all other major weapons of mass destruction. This was 78 years ago. Looking in retrospect, that may have been the last opportunity for humankind to reach sensible agreement against its propensity for disaster. The commission created by Resolution Number 1 was soon disbanded. The focus shifted to partial measures in the nuclear field that were supposed to provide a basis for further progress. Over the following decades, a number of multilateral agreements aiming at curbing the spread of nuclear weapons were adopted, and some limitations measures were reached. 2 categories of weapons of mass destruction, chemical and bacteriological, have been banned by multilateral conventions. Nuclear weapons, however, continue to haunt mankind. Indeed, the 9 countries possessing them keep busy improving their arsenals in what can be described as a veritable technological proliferation. The emphasis on elimination was revived after the 2010 review conference of the NPT, when it found that there was general concern about the catastrophic effects of nuclear detonations. 3 international conferences held in 2013 and 2014 concluded that such effects would not be limited to the borders of belligerent nations, but would instead bring worldwide disaster. No nation or group of nations would be in a position to act effectively with excuse me, to deal effectively with the humanitarian emergency resulting from the use of nuclear weapons. Those developments brought about General Assembly Resolution 71/258 to convene a United Nations conference charged with negotiating a legally binding treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. It is important to stress that the convening of that conference corresponded to the commitment by each state party to Article 6 of the NPT to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of nuclear arms race at an early date and to nuclear disarmament. In July 2017, the conference succeeded in adopting the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, leading to their elimination. It has now 91 signatories, 68 of which have already ratified. In 2022, the parties celebrated the first meeting and took important decisions for the consolidation of the instrument. And a second meeting is scheduled for later this year. No nuclear weapon has ever been destroyed or dismantled by virtue of a multilateral treaty. Weapons of mass destruction cannot be disinvented, but they can be outlawed, as chemical and bacteriological weapons have been. With the requisite will, compliance, verification, and enforcement rules, these rules can be effectively developed and applied. Without the will of the nuclear weapon states, humankind will not be able to realize the general aspiration to get rid of the last remaining category of weapons of mass destruction. In the not so distant past, unilateral decisions or bilateral agreements between the major powers resulted in important reductions of the absurdly huge arsenals that existed at the height of the Cold War. Nevertheless, an estimated 13,000 plus such weapons still exist today, with enough explosive power to blow human civilization out of the planet. At present, however, most of the arms limitation agreements between the United States and Russia have elapsed or been abandoned. The only one remaining is the New START Treaty, concluded in 2010, which has been unilaterally suspended by Russia. Currently, no agreed limitations are enforced for those 2 states or for any other nuclear power for that matter. The elimination of nuclear weapons and means of their delivery remains at best a distant objective for those that possess them. Their numbers have been drastically reduced, but the risks of their use seem to have increased. The nuclear weapon states have stated clearly that they reserve the right to use their weapons in the circumstances that they deem appropriate. This is where the major threat comes from, by deliberate use, accident, or sheer incompetence. Resolution 1887 of the Security Council once declared that the proliferation of nuclear weapons is a major threat to peace and security. No one disputes that statement, but it is the very existence of huge arsenals that in fact pose the greatest threat to world's peace and security. Today, nuclear risks are increasing due to heightened geopolitical competition, arms race dynamics, the decline of arms control, and doubts about compliance with obligations assumed under the nuclear disarmament and non-proliferation regime. During the Cold War, the nuclear weapon states used to argue that nuclear weapons were responsible for the absence of war in Europe since the end of World War II. Well, now we have an armed conflict in Europe, in the European soil, in which 4 of the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states are involved one way or another. This already dangerous state of affairs is dramatically compounded by irresponsible nuclear rhetoric and the potential for nuclear escalation, particularly the deployment of Russian so-called tactical nuclear weapons in the territory of Belarus, and the apparent willingness of the Polish government to house NATO nuclear arms in its soil. We also hear irresponsible talk about the use of tactical weapons, as this would be somehow be not so bad. Resort to nuclear weapons risks being normalized, and the taboo against their use looks increasingly fragile. The latest and very frightening threat came just yesterday from former Russian President Medvedev. The reliance of the international community in commitments regarding security has been further shaken after the invasion of Ukraine by the Russian Federation. The situation of the war on the ground remains undefined, and neither side seems interested in seeking workable terms of peace. This is perhaps the most serious risk ever to the multilateral system of security established by the Charter of the United Nations. The attack by a nuclear power against an adversary that does not possess such means to guarantee its own security is a powerful incentive to proliferation, as we have seen in opinion movements in different countries. The continuation of the conflict in Ukraine is already hindering the functioning of the Security Council. And I stress again that any use of nuclear weapons in this war will have devastating consequences on the non-proliferation regime and might signal the crumbling of the international security structure put in place since 1945. To conclude, nuclear weapons have been with us now for over 75 years. The only role played by these weapons in our shifting political landscape has been indeed to terrify and threaten destruction in a vastly larger scale than any conventional weapons. And their impact is far more indiscriminate and long-lasting than conventional weapons. In the 1970s, the former mayor of Hiroshima, Tadatoshi Akiba, called mayors all over the world to rally against nuclear weapons by pointing out that cities and their populations are the targets rather than military objectives. Nuclear weapons are in fact nothing but instruments of terror, as the Blix Commission characterized them in its well-known report called Weapons of Terror. If the nuclear weapon states do not take the lead to offset the mounting danger once and for all, it is increasingly incumbent on civil society to take action. I congratulate IPB on its work to spread wider understanding by governments and public opinion of the urgent need for concrete progress on nuclear disarmament. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, introducing our next speaker who is joining us online, Kate Hudson. She is the General Secretary of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament and a leading anti-nuclear and anti-war campaigner. She is the author of CND at 60, Britain's most enduring mass movement. The floor is yours, Kate. Thank you.
Thanks very much indeed. And thank you to the International Peace Bureau for organising this important and timely discussion. I'm sure we all have a sense of an increasingly dangerous world and of very rapid changes within our societies that place huge challenges on us all, particularly our most vulnerable communities, of course. Alongside the economic problems like poverty, homelessness, and displacement that faces so many, there is a larger sense of huge global forces at play over which we struggle to exert any influence or control. I'm referring, of course, to the twin existential threats of nuclear war and climate catastrophe, both of which have accelerated this year. One of my main messages today is that we can have an impact, even on these most enormous of problems, because we are part of the global majority that is working for a different vision. And we are part of movements that even within the nuclear weapons states and the polluting industrial parts of the world can have an impact and give voice to the desires of so many for a just and peaceful world. So I would say we have the vision and also we have hope. But to fulfill our potential, we need to understand what is really going on in the world, to understand why we have got to this very worrying and difficult place. So I'm going to take you back a few years to try and get a grip on the global dynamic. When we look at the global tensions that exist in the world today, and we look at the wars that are going on, I would understand the overarching dynamic as being the desire of the United States to maintain its global economic dominance and its willingness to maintain that by any means necessary. In other words, through military might. And the US is, of course, completely unrivaled militarily. The other dynamic in the world is towards multipolar development, towards the states of the global south overcoming the restraints of colonialism and flourishing, taking forward their global leadership on nuclear disarmament, for example. We see this so clearly at the moment with the economies of the BRICS countries surpassing the G7 for the first time, and sooner than expected. Bloomberg estimates that the BRICS nations contribute 32.1% of global growth, compared to the G7's 29.9%, based on the most recent IMF figures. We've seen positive leadership initiatives from the Global South in recent years and months, not just in their advancing of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, but in promoting and working towards peace negotiations in Ukraine. Looking back, I would say we missed a big opportunity to put global peace on a stable footing and develop a different kind of world at the end of the Cold War. When the Warsaw Pact was wound up in 1991, there were hopes that NATO would be dissolved too, and international relations would be founded on a new basis, putting the principles of the UN Charter into force. After decades of tension, there was great hope for a more just and peaceful world, built on political agreement and not on military alliances. It was also hoped there would be a peace dividend, with vast sums going from military into social spending. This did not happen and is currently in reverse. Instead, the US devised a new strategy, the Wolfowitz Doctrine of 1992. This stated that the US was the world's only remaining superpower and proclaimed its main objective was to retain that status. That approach has determined US actions ever since. And NATO, which was now redundant in terms of its initial mission statement as a Cold War alliance, was repurposed to support the US in that objective, expanding its remit and its territory. Europe in particular has been caught up in that process ever since. But that US goal ignores how the world has changed, and trying to force it to remain unipolar will just lead to more wars. The intention of the United States to keep China down presents the risk not only of a Cold War, but of a hot war. The so-called Thucydides trap, where war is inevitable when a great power seeks to obstruct a newly emerging power, must not be allowed to happen. Almost every, unfortunately, step that the US takes seems designed to take us in that direction. the build-up of US forces in the Asia-Pacific, the signing of the AUKUS Pact with the UK and Australia, which will significantly enhance the US military in that region and brings the risk of nuclear proliferation. Not to mention the attempts to get Japan to join AUKUS too. All these developments contribute to tensions in the region and increase the likelihood of war. It's crucial that nuclear proliferation does not increase. The Global South and others must prevail upon South Korea and Japan, for example, not to pursue nuclear weapons. And more so-called nuclear sharing agreements must be prevented, as that's just proliferation too. We see the current examples of NATO nukes in Europe and Russian nukes in Belarus, both illegal under the Nuclear-Non Proliferation Treaty. But tensions in the Asia-Pacific are not the only problem by any means. The illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine has been a disaster for the people of that country and must be wholeheartedly condemned, together with the nuclear threats that have been made. We also condemn the expansion of NATO, that since the 1990s has hugely expanded that nuclear-armed alliance, driving US military might into Eastern Europe and beyond, within the borders of the former Soviet Union. It has also expanded the remit of NATO from a defensive alliance into one that engages in so-called out-of-area activities that included a 20-year war in Afghanistan, a toehold in Latin America, a commitment to weapons in space. A terrible byproduct of the Ukraine war has been a rapidly intensifying militarization, particularly within Europe. Not only does this increase the risks of the war escalating, it also takes money away from public goods like healthcare and social support and puts it into weapons of war and the pockets of the arms manufacturers. It also, through uncritical support for pursuing the war to a military conclusion, contributes to a militaristic culture where war fighting is celebrated and nationalism increases. These are just a small fraction of the challenges we face today as a peace movement, but as a global community too. The scale of the arms trade, the extent of wars and killing, the brutalization of communities and destruction of infrastructure, the contamination and contribution of military emissions to global warming. All these lie within the framework of what the international community has to address. It's a big challenge, but these are issues that are crucial to the future of humanity and to all forms of life. In the longer term, I'm confident that the rise of the Global South will diminish the nuclear risks, but in the meantime, the risk of nuclear war is high. It may be that we need a more militant initiative against the current nuclear order from the non-nuclear weapons states, and a clear stating that the current so-called rules-based international order serves the interests of a minority. We need a new international order based on sustainable and just economic relations, with the UN at its heart. International arms control is at an all-time low and has been primarily destroyed by the US, first with the destruction of the ABM Treaty by Bush and subsequently by Trump. The US is the self-proclaimed guardian of the international order, which it largely constructed in its own interests in 1945. But it needs to recognise that change is happening and that it needs to get its own house in order. As for the NPT itself, can it be strengthened and play a useful role, given that it is ignored by nuclear weapons states, whether by failing to pursue their disarmament obligations or actively introducing proliferation through developments like AUKUS? And we know, of course, that it was the failure of the NPT to bring disarmament that was the key motivator for the development of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Now more than ever, we need to bring change and to adopt a broad concept of security, which addresses the two existential threats that we face, climate change and nuclear war. And we need policies and actions from governments which will reduce and eventually remove those threats. In the peace movement, our concept of security is one of genuine human security, not of killing and increased militarization or the further expansion of military blocs, but of human rights, respect for all, dignity and meeting of people's needs, and of course, a world free from the threat of nuclear annihilation. That is the view shared by the overwhelming global majority, and we will continue to work for that vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Kate, for such a comprehensive overview of the current challenges that we're facing, and I guess on a more positive note, the opportunities that are available to us as well. Our next speaker is Vanessa Lanteigne. She is a Rotary Peace Fellow and was previously the National Coordinator for the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace. She is currently a Program Officer at the Parliamentarians for Nuclear-Non Proliferation and Disarmament. Thank you, Vanessa.
Thank you for the introduction, Alessandra, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for being here, and thank you for all your time, efforts, and dedication to get here. So yes, my name is Vanessa Lanteigne, and I'm currently a Program Officer for PNND, which stands for Parliamentarians for Nuclear-Non Proliferation and Disarmament. We are presenting a statement in the plenary soon, so I might need to step out a bit early, so I apologize in advance if that does happen. But I want to speak today about the growing military and nuclear expenditures, deterrence, new campaigns and nuclear arms control, and strengthening international law and human rights as a means for ensuring common and human security. So as you heard, I was the National Coordinator for the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace, Canada's longest running women's peace organization, where in one of the campaigns we partnered with other organizations for a parliamentary petition, which was urging the government of Canada to join the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. The treaty has widespread support among Canadians, with one poll saying that 74% of Canadians are in favor of joining, with only 14% opposed. The petition was read in the Canadian Parliament, but despite the 74% support of the public, the government of Canada was and still is unwilling to join the TPNW. So Canada relies on nuclear deterrence under the nuclear umbrella of NATO and is not alone. 36 other countries do not have nuclear weapons, but rely on nuclear deterrence through countries or alliances that do. So this framework of nuclear deterrence requires countries to spend enormous amounts of taxpayer money, approximately $100 billion a year, which works out to around 157,000 US dollars per minute. So to put this into context, estimates for ending global hunger are around 40 billion per year, but instead of feeding the world's most vulnerable people, we put twice that amount of money into a weapon that we can't ever use. So I don't know about everyone else here, but I know that when I talk to many of my friends and family about nuclear weapons policy, I can just see their eyes glaze over. For a lot of people, it is just too overwhelming to even think about, and it's hard for me to blame them because we have concurrent crises of climate change, the threat of nuclear weapons, mass displacements of people, the Russia-Ukraine war, and to top it all off a few days ago, I'm sure mostly everyone has already heard about this, non-human biologics were apparently recovered at alleged UFO crash sites. So being mildly informed on these topics is honestly a lot for most people, including myself. So while I do have quite a bit of information in this speech that is hard to process, I do hope to leave you with a bit of hope at the end. So yes, when we talk about the role of nuclear weapons in a shifting geopolitical landscape, it is not to talk, it's hard not to talk about a few things, including the shifting climate, the Russia-Ukraine war, and the increases in global military expenditures and the push for new frameworks for disarmament and security perspectives. So I'll go a little bit personal here, going into climate change. And by now, we have probably all been impacted by climate change in one way or another. My family in Canada talks about how they used to play hockey on the lakes, and now they don't even freeze. More critically, though, the summers are so hot and dry that we are on constant alert for wildfires. And a few years ago, there was a fire just 40 minutes from my home, and one man died fighting the fire. In Lytton, 2 years ago, in the town of Lytton, which is 3 hours from Vancouver in Canada, recorded Canada's hottest ever temperature, and the next day, 90% of the town burned to the ground, and they are still recovering. The Insurance Bureau of Canada said that severe weather-related insurance damage went up to $1.5 billion that year. And I want to address, similarly, like Kate mentioned as well, a major elephant in the room in terms of talking about climate change, which is the carbon emissions from militaries. So in Canada, like in most NATO countries, the military is the largest institutional emitter of carbon, with the US military the single largest institutional source of greenhouse gas emissions in the world, according to Brown's University's Costs of War project. So even though Canada has over 4,000 wildfires burning right now, and 5 people have lost their lives fighting them just this year, Canada is on track to purchase 88 F-35 fighter jets with life cycle costs of $76 billion. Just 1 hour of operation for just one jet is around $60,000, which is a Canadian's average yearly salary. So I'll just repeat this: 1 hour for one jet of operation equals a year's average salary. Investing in water bombers, airplanes to fight fires instead of wars is something we have to shift to. The recent procurements of these fighter jets alongside the proposed 15 warships, the attack helicopters, the armed drones, LAVs, and other equipment is locking Canada into decades of fossil fuel emissions, and we're not alone in these procurements. So climate change costs a lot in every sense, and those costs will increase, putting stress on national budgets for things like disaster management and emergency relief. The other side of this is that nuclear deterrence and deterrence based on ever-expanding military power is expensive and exacerbating the climate crisis. So I want to turn now to nuclear and military deterrence, which doesn't seem to be working. As Sérgio mentioned, we feel like we're all reading the same things and putting them into our speeches. But a top advisor to Putin made another nuclear threat to Ukraine, Medvedev, which is being backed by the US military aid, among other countries, including nuclear armed states. Both sides do not look as though they will be stopping their roles in this conflict anytime soon, which is fueling also the justification to continue the arms race. And that is why this conference, treaties, initiatives, campaigns are so important right now. It's because we don't want to slip backwards. Already, all nuclear armed countries are modernizing their nuclear arsenals, and several deployed new nuclear armed or nuclear capable weapon systems in 2022. But we cannot slip back into the trend of massive increases in nuclear arsenals. There's so many reasons why we must work to strengthen disarmament processes, but I'll limit the rest of this address to talking about campaigns for international human rights law and international instruments for justice. So there are some potential initiatives and positives coming out, which I'll speak to now. In 2022, the leaders at the G20 in Bali declared that the threat or use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, which is a remarkable development. PNND would like this statement to be affirmed and implemented by the 11th NPT Review Conference and to move towards codifying it. Unfortunately, with all nuclear armed states modernizing and the nuclear posturing in the Russia-Ukraine war, the suspension of the New START treaty, among other things, it feels as though we're simply trying to stop the backslide of the progress that has been made instead of what we really must be doing, which is creating a strong framework for sustained and transparent disarmament. PNND is proposing that the NPT establishes a subsidiary body to explore nuclear non-proliferation, risk reduction, and disarmament issues in a broader security framework of common and human security, incorporating gender, peace, diplomacy, conflict resolution, and international law. This broader framework of common and human security will be beneficial to giving diverse perspectives, opportunities to participate in conflict resolution and security fields to ensure that inclusivity is fully and substantively implemented, but also that this subsidiary body would be enhanced and have more possibility for success if it broadened its diplomatic toolbox to also include a range of approaches to peace and security in order to utilize a more diverse, comprehensive, and holistic security framework. There was a statement initiated by the Basel Peace Office, Unfold Zero, World Future Council, and World Federalist Movement Institute for Global Policy on Common Security on how to replace nuclear deterrence, which is very promising and is endorsed by 130 organizations and 32 countries. I hope that you will check it out. And shifting from nuclear deterrence to common security challenges challenges the deterrence assumption by outlining how national security cannot be obtained by undermining or threatening the security of others, but rather on resolving conflict with one's adversaries and ensuring that the security of all is upheld. It relies on diplomacy, negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and on the application of international law. I'll read part of the definition here, which is common security does not rule out national defense and some reliance on military power for security. However, a common security framework places a much greater emphasis on conflict resolution and international law, reserving military approaches to the last resort in response to aggression if all other methods fail and in strict adherence to the UN Charter. Also of note is the Abolition 2000 Working Group on Nuclear Risk Reduction in cooperation with No First Use Global, who are presenting the nuclear taboo from norm to law to the states parties to the NPT, which calls on the NPT and the UN General Assembly to enshrine as a dictate of international law that the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons is inadmissible, taking the statement directly from the G20 in Bali. Similarly, on strengthening international law, Abolition 2000 has drafted a working paper entitled Nuclear Weapons Conventions Reset, Frameworks for a Nuclear Weapon-Free World, outlining 3 recommendations which you can find on their website. In addition, the International Court of Justice and the UN Human Rights Committee have affirmed a universal and unconditional obligation to achieve a nuclear weapon-free world. The International Court of Justice has demonstrated on numerous cases and advisory opinions that it can address aggression, including the threat or use of nuclear weapons, territorial conflicts, and other threats to the peace. Increased use of the court and increased acceptance of the jurisdiction of the ICJ would build confidence in the capacity of common security to replace nuclear deterrence. And finally, the Nuclear Weapons Convention Reset Working Paper also notes, and I think this is really important, that the implementation of these obligations is not contingent on a situation of peace, but must be pursued at all times, and that indeed implementation of these obligations could also contribute to the building of confidence and peace. So in sum, as we talk about the shifting role of nuclear weapons in geopolitics, we also need to respond with creative responses in pursuit of disarmament and peace. I'd like to end with some hope, which keeps me going, and it's that disarmament and institutions hold so much potential to unlock funding and capacity that can help the world address our pressing humanitarian needs arising from the consequences of climate change and instability from conflict. We can shift our understandings of security to make us all more secure and move to disarm in order for us to work cooperatively on our common and human security and strengthen the institutions that safeguard our rights. Here's to hoping that this next NPT will not only stop the backslide, but reinvigorate the nuclear disarmament movement of which we are all a part of. We must support the campaigns and stress to states parties what was agreed to previously, which is declaring their intention to achieve at the earliest possible date the cessation of the nuclear arms race and to undertake effective measures in the direction of nuclear disarmament. I firmly believe that a paradigm shift of security is how we can find the solutions to the problems we're facing. We can unlock the funding that can be saved from the nuclear and conventional arms race. We can save the atmosphere from the emissions that won't be burned from ever increasing military arsenals and investing in sustainable development. And we can save countless lives from fleeing uninhabitable climates and armed conflict by investing in international tools of accountability, justice, diplomacy, and peace. So I want to thank IPB for this opportunity to speak and look forward to learning more from our esteemed panelists. If you're interested in getting a copy of my speech and sources or learning more, my email is vanessa@pnnd.org, and I'll leave a few cards out with my contact info. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, also for covering such an important and broad range of issues within a very short amount of time as well. And personally, I very much appreciated your focus on the military and climate nexus, if you will. Thank you. Our next speaker is Stephanie Verlaan. Stephanie holds a Bachelor in social science, a master's in intercultural conflict management, and is currently completing a Master of Laws in international human rights and humanitarian law. She interned with the International Peace Bureau in 2021 and 2022, during which she worked primarily on global nuclear abolition campaign. She was also a member of the Emerging Voices Network, the 2023 policy cycle, with BASIC, for which she co-authored a policy paper discussing racial undertones with Western narratives on nuclear policies. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thanks, Alessandra. As Alessandra just mentioned, I used to intern for IPB. It was actually almost 1 year ago to the day that I finished my term with them. My experience with IPB was actually my introduction to disarmament and non-proliferation in general. So prior to working for them, I had really no understanding of this concept or this field at all. So I'm definitely a newcomer, which is something that I will touch on quite a lot in my speech. And I will also cover, there will be some similarities between what Kate touched on as well, particularly to do with the climate crisis, as well as what Vanessa did. So I want to begin by mentioning an article that was published last week in Politico, which is like a website that was titled "The Dangerous and Frightening Disappearance of the Nuclear Expert." The article lamented on the dwindling number of new nuclear policy experts entering the field, that as the current generation approaches retirement, there are fewer candidates to replace them, and that without the next generation of nuclear policy wonks, the prevailing deterrence strategies and the positioning of nuclear weapons within that will become diluted and the concept lost. It wondered who then will inform the President and Congress on why nuclear weapons remain important to national security and investment in them is worthwhile. This article attracted quite a lot of discussion on Twitter. The responses were very polarized. Some came from government, think tanks or NGOs, and others from senior scholars and retired nuclear policy experts, as well as younger emerging scholars and activists. One aspect that seemed consistent amongst the commentators was that there is definitely no shortage of young people wanting a career related to nuclear weapons in international relations. I know this because I'm one of them. There are more people than there are jobs. Competition for internships is fierce, with many ending up to simply work for free. It seems that the young people of today interested in these issues are not wanting to contribute to the discourse in a warfighting context, but on the contrary, they want to contribute their efforts to a global peace, one in which there is no role for nuclear weapons. They're not interested in going to work for a governmental institution where they will be tasked with ensuring the perpetuation of a narrative they either do not understand, believe to be ineffective, or actively disagree with. They want to dedicate their efforts to the abolition of nuclear weapons rather than their continuation. For me, this decline signals a few things, and not necessarily that we're closer to achieving full implementation of Article 6. Firstly, this signals that there are other threats young people see as deserving of greater attention. It's perplexing to watch as young people flock to the streets around the world to demonstrate against the lack of action on the climate crisis or the rising cost of living. The concerns validated by cold, hard science, and the consensus of this is in the millions. Other areas such as artificial intelligence, emerging technology, cyber warfare, and the weaponization of space technology are also attracting large numbers of new recruits, many of whom seem less resistant to lending their knowledge of these areas to the public sector as they are to the nuclear space. Possibly due to higher salaries being offered, which is important because we all have rent to pay, but mostly because they're emerging fields that carry less dusty jargon than the nuclear field and where everyone is learning together. Interestingly, as well, as these technologies develop and proliferate, the range of actors capable of employing them also increases. States are at just as great a risk of a cyber attack from an underground hacker group as they are from a state, but at least with a state, they have international law to fall back on. A 2016 report by a coalition of primarily UK NGOs called the Emidan Group analysed the UK's national security strategy. I think actually CND might be a member of the Emidan Group, if I'm not mistaken, and they might have also changed their name so far. Since then, they might be called something else now. But it basically found that the UK's primary security concerns were from human threats, such as terrorist groups, domestic extremism, and adversarial states, against which it deemed its best defence was to project dominance through having a strong military presence internationally, of which its Trident arsenal held a key role. Part of this was that it perceives itself to be in competition with France to be the main protector of Europe, and part wanting to align with the US and secure itself within the Alpha Club. The report concluded that nothing about its strategy was actually strategic. Despite all the evidence, governments still perceive each other and other humans as the greatest threat to their security and continue to seek reassurance in weapons of mass destruction and a set of untestable assumptions that a strong nuclear deterrent is the best way to ensure their security. The TPNW is another significant factor in the changing nuclear weapon landscape, and for youth especially. Prior to the TPNW, the NPT was the only mechanism under which nuclear abolition was possible. The stalemate on disarmament, which began in the early 2000s, became the norm, with the same reasons for why progress was not possible being circulated again and again. To those who had been working in the field for some time, whether pushing for disarmament or advocating for continued deterrence, disarmament negotiations must have felt like a never-ending game of Monopoly, where you had to continue playing long after the game lost meaning. This spun the narrative that possession of nuclear weapons was legitimate so long as the possessor states simply felt it to be so, and that the remaining states needed to either accept that or take it upon themselves, the responsibility of creating the conditions for disarmament, as the US famously put it. Under these conditions, I imagine the abolition movement and non-nuclear possessor states would have felt powerless and cornered, with little optimism for disarmament prospects. The TPNW came into play and changed all of that. For states, it offered a new place in which to argue, negotiate, and exercise their rights as states within international law. For civil society, it provided a whole new instrument to study, pick apart, and analyse. Although it's yet to achieve its ultimate goal of total nuclear abolition, the treaty is already a success simply by the number of ratifying states, and this number is constantly growing. It has set a new standard and a new goal for everyone. For youth and newcomers to the field, such as myself, the TPNW is especially significant. For those who were around prior to the TPNW, they remember the dynamics and struggles inherent to that environment and will be able to compare that to the environment now. Whereas for the newcomers, we have never known the nuclear space without the TPNW. The standard it sets for us is the norm. We have never known anything different. As the discussions around the TPNW continue to evolve and the number of states parties grow, new people will enter the field in which there is an existing and highly developed narrative. This will be true for civil society groups around the world, not just those in the West. It will be interesting to see how the narrative will continue to evolve in a post-TPNW environment as new generations of policymakers and civil society members continue to come into being and begin their careers in this new environment. Lastly, as the impacts of the climate crisis begin to accelerate and its effects spread, the disparity between affected continents, states, and populations shrinks. Never before has Earth's entire population faced the same threat of this scale and at the same time, whilst also being defenseless against it and having to stand by whilst their governments sit idly with their heads in the sand. It is the youth who are leading the protests around environmental destruction around the world, and it is the same around the world. From Sweden to Thailand to India to Australia to Ghana, it is the young people of these countries who are frequently banding together in masses of tens of thousands to demand action by their governments. What is more, the young people protesting in these different cities, states, and continents are also connected with each other through social media in a way that wasn't possible for prior generations. This connection and knowing that others around the world are facing the same threats and are fighting for the same changes seems to strengthen their resolve to continue the fight. I see something similar happening within the nuclear weapon space. Firstly, that the climate crisis and nuclear weapons are very much interconnected, but also the threat of annihilation of one's home by a nuclear detonation is as horrific and present as is losing one's home to a climate-induced wildfire. This provides a further point of which the various youth movements will converge. And that's all. Thank you for your time and attention, and I look forward to continuing the discussion.
Thank you so much, Stephanie, especially for, I think, concluding our event today on a very important topic, and I think something that we tend to forget quite easily, the role and the participation of youth. I think we can open the floor for a Q&A. If anyone has any questions, including online. Yeah, go ahead.
Hello. I just was at the press conference of the IPBNW, where they were talking about the Zaporizhzhia, how to say, what would happen when they go on with Zaporizhzhia. But there's something else what I wanted to say. One group of NGOs is going for ecocide, they call themselves Stop Ecocide. The idea is to make ecocide a major crime at the UN level. And I think that could be very interesting when there would be more working together with them, because well, the law would then be here in Vienna at the UNODC, and they are quite pushing for that. And if they would reach anywhere to do this law on the highest level, it would also affect military, and it would affect all others, civilian companies who make damages to the environment and everything. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hello, everyone. I'm Alan Ware with Parliamentarians for Nuclear-Non Proliferation and Disarmament, the World Future Council and the World Federalist Movement. I want to thank IPB for putting on this event, and to the speakers. I have a question for both Kate and for Vanessa. And you've talked about common security and human security and like the overlapping between those. So common security is more to do with the international relations and ensuring that the countries resolve their conflicts peacefully, as they're required to do under the UN Charter, and not to resort to the threat or use of force. And human security, of course, is meeting the human needs, sustainable development goals, human rights, and they are integrated very much. Where does feminist foreign policy fit in with this? And are the feminist foreign policies that are advanced and adopted by Canada, Germany, Sweden, are they genuine? Or are these countries just putting those, feminist foreign policy out as something to say, hey, aren't we doing good, while they're still maintaining very nationalistic, very militaristic policies? And I think both Vanessa and Kate may be interested in commenting on that. Thank you.
I hope it's okay if I take the floor first. Yes, thank you for a little bit of clarification on the difference between common security and human security. And I do want to speak to Canada's Principles of Feminist International Assistance. This was released, I believe, in 2017, which is the same year that Canada released its Strong, Secure, Engaged, which is Canada's defense policy and what it's currently working under right now. This defense policy increased the military budget by 70%. And if you do read it, they do have an emphasis on women and men throughout the entire document. Women the word is put before men. And this was in response to a very damning report by Marie Deschamps, which came out just a year before. And so you can really tell that Canada is trying to improve its international reputation, because along those same lines, there are 13 of the highest military commanders who are under investigation for serious sexual misconduct and assault charges. Just one after the other were consecutively toppling down. So you can really see that, especially with the Trudeau government and him self-proclaiming himself to be a feminist, you can really tell that Canada was pushing this narrative of Canada's feminist foreign policies. But I think that Canada actually does not have one overarching foreign policy, so they have multiple policy documents. And I think personally, from what I've read in Strong, Secure, Engaged, it is almost completely divorced from the feminist foreign principles that it's released in the separate package. So I think there's two streams going that way, because also in the report by Marie Deschamps, it says that it was a hostile environment to women, but also to people of the LGBTQ2IA community. And there is no mention of LGBTQ within Strong, Secure, Engaged. So, just a few points that I think what Canada is trying to do is pursue the international reputation of having feminist foreign policies in its international assistance policy, but it is not making those foundational or structural changes, agenda setting changes that a lot of us are calling for, especially as there are the sexual assault allegations and the highly militarized masculinities that are within the Canadian military that Marie Deschamps outlined as being hostile to women and LGBTQ people. So I think there's two different tracks there.
Kate, did you have anything that you'd like to add?
Yeah, well, just very briefly, just on the first point about ecocide, it's been quite interesting for us to watch the development of that as a kind of specific term to describe a whole category of terrible offences against the environment and ecology. And at the start, I remember people thinking, ecocide, what's that? But in actual fact, it's turned out to be a very, very helpful way of bringing together and kind of describing better and more effectively those kinds of challenges. And of course, those kinds of crimes have already been outlawed in a whole range of legislation, I think from the Geneva Conventions and laws of war and so on about damage to the environment. But I think this really brings it up to date. So I think that's a very positive development, and it's a term now that's even used in the political environment here in Britain. So let's hope that that's advanced and indeed properly complied with, which of course is the big challenge. And then in terms of feminist foreign policy, I suppose just making a kind of broader point about it, we've seen how as well as countries, some countries feeling that they want to do the right thing and look good on this. We've also seen how NATO's, been talking the talk somewhat on, women and so on. And I think that we have to make sure that we don't just have kind of tokenistic noises and gestures about this, and it's not kind of reduced to, do we have more women in leading positions in the armed forces and those kinds of things. It can't be that. If we're going to have anything really meaningful, it's got to be about a shift in values. And of course, thinking back to those discussions, particularly in the peace movement, I mean, in Britain and elsewhere, no doubt in the 1980s around, Greenham Common and the women's peace movement and so on, trying to sort of reconceptualize and really transform the way in which violence and war is understood. I think bringing some of that discussion into the debate and into what we're pushing for is really important too.
Yes, thanks. Just to add to what Kate was saying, which I completely agree with. I had an interview with the Canada's head of gender diversity and inclusion during the Canadian Voice of Women for Peace's No Fighter Jets campaign, and I asked her because Canada has instituted a gender-based analysis plus for all procurements and programs and policies a few years ago. I think it was 5 years ago. And so I asked her if there were things that GBA plus, gender-based analysis plus, which looks at the intersectionalities of gender and other identities, if an analysis has been made on the fighter jet procurement, in particular to how they're going to be used. So for example, in 2011, Canada led the NATO bombing of Libya, and there was civilian infrastructure that was bombed. It's led to 4 million people being without potable water when water facilities were bombed. So I asked her about this, and she said that they are doing gender-based analysis plus, but the example that she had given me was that for the fighter jet, they are doing a gender-based analysis for it. But the example that she gave me was that they are modifying the cockpit to allow women to be able to fit and fly the plane, which apparently is the angle that they're going for. I just wanted to highlight the add women and stir to the general narrative that Kate was mentioning. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Also online? Yep, Tom, go ahead.
Thank you for organising this meeting, and thanks to our speakers. My name's Tom Hunter-Rayner, and I'm the chair of the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. One of the things that struck me most about Sérgio Duarte's contribution was the following phrase, where he said, stability is a relative concept. And just thinking back over the past 5, 7, 8 years, and the way in which the role of, and the potentially deadly role of nuclear weapons in the shaping of the global order and in the shaping of international relations has been, very much revealed and put to the fore. My mind immediately on hearing Sérgio Duarte was, well, what next? How much worse could it get? Because we are living in times of acute threat and acute danger. There's all sorts of evidence to that end. But when we, recall the experience of Trump presidency and the way in which nuclear weapons were put front and center of his global strategy, could we have at that point conceived of the nuclear tensions and the nuclear threat we face now? So, 12 months from now, will stability as a relative concept still be something that we hold in our heads? And if so, what are the coming dangers? And I'm asking this because I'm interested in, developing a sense of urgency now, and a sense of urgency that's certainly lacking from the plenary debates we've had over the past few days here. But developing a sense of urgency now and thinking about, what might come next to just encourage and, reinforce our calls for some actual action on disarmament and for reducing nuclear tensions, because I haven't seen much evidence of that over the past couple of days in this building. So that was a question really for the speakers to respond to.
I can comment on that if that's helpful. Hello?
Go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. Thanks. Well, hello, Tom. Interesting talking to you in Vienna. Good. Hope you're having a good time. Yeah, I think that, well, I suppose I'm often struck by how people have got the capacity to face massively accelerating dangers and continue with the same kind of narrative and the same kind of approach that they do in times of less danger. And I suppose I'm talking about our government here in Britain as well. And not only is it not seeming to understand the dangers, it seems to be actively contributing to making them worse, which I think is one particular challenge that we face. But in terms of coming dangers, I mean, I can see a lot looming, as I mentioned in my contribution earlier. I think the most immediate danger, of course, is that of nuclear use in Ukraine. And of course, that is something which is so immediate, and you know, all the kind of factors are there in play, and all the options, presumably all the military options, are there in play, or you know, ready to go. It's hard to see how discussion in this kind of forum, or you know, discussions around arms control or arms reductions, you know, absolutely fundamental as those are and must be continued, what are the mechanisms for ensuring that there's a pullback from the current global tensions, the current nuclear tensions around Ukraine? You know, what is the kind of international mechanism for ensuring that a leader or a commander or whatever doesn't put their finger on the button, or you know, hasn't been taken in by the idea that you can use a battlefield nuke and everything will be fine? You know, that it's a kind of relatively small containable thing, as Sérgio mentioned in his contribution. You know, so what are the international mechanisms for preventing that happening? Because at the moment, it seems like we're on this kind of escalator towards use, and you know, no one's stopping it and making people get off. You know, so I think that's the challenge. And is such a discussion possible at the NPT? I guess that it's not possible in the kind of open forum, but is it possible behind the scenes, that because all the main actors are here? You know, is it possible that behind the scenes there can be some moves towards negotiation or discussion about how to step back from that worst case scenario? And I think it really demonstrates more clearly than anything how the most pressing issue in the world today is to get a ceasefire and peace negotiations in Ukraine. You know, that war has to stop, because the alternative is pretty unthinkable. So that's the biggest challenge for the international community today. You know, some countries, you know, as I mentioned earlier, they mean peace initiatives from Brazil, for example, you know, from the Pope, from the UN, from China. You know, how can those be taken up and enacted? That's the biggest coming danger, as far as I can see.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah.
Sorry, I just want to add something on to Kate's comments, which is really, really accurate. I think of where the most present dangers are. I heard from one of your other colleagues that the peace summit that you held in Vienna a couple of weeks ago, that this received quite a lot of threats because apparently it was viewed as if you are, you know, anti sending weapons to Ukraine, then and anti-arming Ukraine to be able to defend itself, this automatically translates into being pro-Russia. And it seems as though there is like a complete disconnect of where people, I guess like the mainstreams, I don't know who was, making these comments, but that there is a disconnect between the middle ground, and that even if we are able to broker a ceasefire, unless we can address the underlying causes of what led to this war in the first place, it will just be, any ceasefire will only be temporary. And we'll see, maybe Russia does stop the attacks and they go away. They will just be wounded for a short period, and then they will come back and the same war will continue, maybe against Ukraine, maybe involving other states and other actors as well. So like Kate said, we really need to address the underlying causes, which all comes back to at the end, building a security architecture that's based on the principles of common security, where there is no hierarchy of societies of whose right to security is ranked by depending on who is the wealthiest, who is the whitest, who is the smartest. People seem to just only be able to analyze the situation with what they see directly in front of them, and they're unable to look beyond and deeper into the underlying causes. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is, to be honest. I don't know how we do this, but I just know that this is something that has to be done and we have to find a way.
Thanks. We have a comment here in the room.
Hello, I am Angelika and I am on the NGO committees here at the UN in Vienna. I had been at the Peace Summit. The colleague here from France was there too, and it is true. And thank you very much that you mentioned this. There had been a lot of offensive people, and they even had, the organizers was the International Peace Bureau, also had to find a new place, because the trade union in Austria, where they should have been before, was they just 2 days before the event cancelled the room, and then they had to go to find in 2 days other places. So it is really crazy what is going on. Thank you for mentioning this.
Okay, I have a question for Stephanie, a question that with an answer that may, I guess, seem quite obvious, but what would you like to see in our organizations and institutions in terms of what they can do and what they can change to better facilitate the role of youth in nuclear disarmament?
This is a really complex question to answer, and there's like many different answers and solutions that I could try to hypothesize that might be befitting for the situation and the problems that we need to address. But for me, the main, and this isn't just necessarily about facilitating the inclusion of youth, but which is definitely a part of it, but it's also about trying to steer this giant ship that we're all on away from catastrophe. And going with this analogy, ships turn very slowly. And so I think that we need to do it incrementally. and generation by generation, as as each new generation of policy experts, peacemakers, civil society activists, as each new generation rises to then be in a position where they can take on positions of where they will have a voice and can make a change. It's about shifting the mindset. And I think at the risk of not wanting to sound ageist, there is like, you know, older people who have, you know, worked in these policy institutions and in government for years. They have very institutionalized mindsets that is very, very, very difficult to change. And whilst there is some efficacy in targeting that, I think where you're going to get more traction and quicker traction is if you target the mindsets of the youth. And for me, this starts with education, disarmament education, incorporating this, you know, definitely at like the primary, like high school level, but more importantly at the tertiary level. And it doesn't just need to be focused on students who are studying political science or international relations. It's also all the people who are going into STEM, in engineering, into all these other areas, because maybe they're not going to be making the policy, but they are going to be the ones who are designing these weapons and who you know, are designing this new infrastructure. And so they also need to be instilled with the same kinds of code of ethics, I suppose, that is really important if we are to move forward. So for me, it comes with like building in robustly, you know, critical thinking skills into the next generation, so that they're like, you know, able to analyze situations themselves without just accepting what is put in front of them. So then when they are entering these institutions and the field for the first time, they're already equipped with a resilient skill set to be able to form their own opinions, and they're not so susceptible to being immediately indoctrinated into the, you know, the prevailing narratives that we have seen again and again passed down through generations. And my first thought when I read this article that I mentioned was that maybe this has been what happened, is that this is why the nuclear policy expert in the US administration has faded out. I don't know. It's just one aspect which I think is very interesting. And yeah, for me, education is where it starts, and it's a really good place. Sorry, Kate, you've been waiting for ages.
I need to just pick up on something you said that I thought what you said was very interesting, and it made me think. I mean, obviously, we're aware that, I mean, here in Britain, opinion polls show that the majority of the younger generation, so to speak, is more opposed to nuclear weapons, you know, than in some older demographics, not all. And in fact, generally speaking, across all demographics, you know, people are more in favour of nuclear disarmament than not. So it's quite interesting. But it's marked in the younger generation, the younger demographic. But it strikes me that in every generation, you know, looking back over the decades and so on, there's kind of virtually always been a struggle within that generation, you know, within that age group which is coming up. There's always been a struggle for, you know, let's say good politics versus bad politics, however you define that, you know. So there's a struggle, you know, for the values of peace or the values of social justice and so on, wanting to do things differently. that struggle always takes place pretty much in every generation. It's expressed in different ways or comes through different struggles, but that's what happens. But unfortunately, too often in recent times, we've seen the ascendancy of the kind of, you know, more conservative with a small c, or more war orientated, or more, you know, profit and market orientated, you know, and that's what's happened. So it's not as if, you know, the older generation and, you know, older generations have created these institutions and they just want to carry them on. It's always been contested, but the kind of side of peace and progress hasn't won out so often, you know. So I suppose I tend to see it more in that way, you know, and there is this great challenge about how to change the structures, you know, which are built in this way, and how to change the dominant narratives that you're referring to, you know, and whatever age people are, they can play a role in challenging those, you know. So I suppose I sort of just would see it slightly wider than an age thing and more about people with, you know, peace values, let's say, as shorthand. You know, how can they come together to overturn this dominant narrative? Because, you know, whatever age we are, there's kind of, well, probably the majority of us are desperate to change this situation, but the kind of establishment structures are so powerful that it's preventing us doing that. I mean, you know, the most recent kind of great articulator and current great articulator of, you know, peace and justice values in Britain is one of our vice presidents in C&D, Jeremy Corbyn, who's 70 or something. You know what I mean? His attraction and his popularity is with the youth because of the values that he expresses, you know. So it's kind of working together across the generations is really important, as well as the younger generation doing things in new ways that are best fitted to them and their current experience of what the world's like at the moment.
I think we have a question in the chat for Stephanie.
The one from Ruth, actually, I think you mean. I was just trying to figure out, I was just like typing something and trying to work out what I would actually say. So the three issues that the question mentions of, you know, the military climate threat, the nuclear ban, and the nuclear threat, which I guess, you know, it all just ties into, yeah, it's basically the nexus between climate change and the military industrial complex. In terms of, you know, the youth are, as we've mentioned, the youth are all very much engaged, but there is still millions of youth out there who are not engaged, who are not interested, who are just not aware. And the best way I would say to, or, you know, I imagine would be to engage these outlying people, would be to find a way to connect it to their lives, you know, their interests, explain to them how these problems are going to impact their lives and their futures. What is available to you now, it might not be available to you, you know, in like 20 years time. Like, you want to go to Australia and swim in the Whitsundays, well, the reef isn't going to be there in 10 years time. So if you want to have these experiences, then you need to do something to help preserve these places of our world. So it's about appealing to their interests and their experiences, I would say. Yeah, I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Any final comments, questions? Okay, I think in that case, that will conclude our session today. Thank you very much to Kate, Stephanie, and also to Vanessa, who had to leave to give another presentation. Tomorrow from 3:30 to 5:30, we will have our final side event. The title is Technology, Artificial Intelligence and Nuclear Weapons. We'll have two speakers join us virtually, Michael Clare and Jürgen Altman. So we hope to see you tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the conference.